Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Concordia University's Force Space. Thank you for joining us for the next part of Military Imaginaries. This is our keynote presentation titled War Subjects of and Against the Environment of Terror. Just to help situate you, of course, we are streaming to YouTube. We are live here at Force Space. We are located on unceded Indigenous lands. Those of you joining us by Zoom, we'd love your comments and your questions in the chat. We can read them out later. Those of you here in the space probably know, just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you. Okay, to help introduce our keynote speaker, it's very much my pleasure to hand the microphone back to our event co-organizer and also postdoctoral fellow in communication studies at Concordia, Alexandra Martin. Alexandra, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I would like to introduce you to our closing keynote, Svitlana Matviyenko. So Svitlana Matviyenko is an associate professor of critical media analysis in the School of Communication and associate director of the Digital Democracies Institute, a research and teaching informed by science and technology studies and history of science or focused on information and cyberwar, media and environment, critical infrastructure studies, and postcolonial theory. Matviyenko's current work on nuclear cultures and heritage investigates the practice of nuclear terror, weaponization of pollution, and technogenic catastrophes during the Russian war in Ukraine. Matviyenko is a co-editor of two collections, the Imaginary app, MIT Press, and Lacan and the Posthuman. She is a co-author of Cyberwar and Revolution, Digital Subterfuge in Global Capitalism, a winner of the 2019 Book Award of Science, Technology, and Art in International Relations section of the International Studies Association and of the Canadian Communication Association 2020 Gertrude J. Robinson Book Prize. Thank you.
Everyone, do you hear me well?
Do hear you well.
All right,
Thank
wonderful. So I thank you very much for this invitation to speak in this event. I thank everyone who is involved in organization and to everyone who joined us here online and I imagine offline, even though I don't see you, but I think someone is in the audience. All right. In a second, I will share my presentation with you, but I think it will be best if I actually turn off my camera and let you just see my slides. That's how this presentation is designed, that your attention will be drawn to the screen, to these images, and then I will come back in for the conversation, for questions, and so on. All right, so now I'm going to disappear and will share my screen with you. All right. At this moment, I see that you see my slides. And let's begin. So as much as I'm happy to be here, the topic that I'm going to be talking about is extremely heavy, difficult to speak about, to think, to listen. So that's why I'm even more grateful to you for the opportunity of this engagement. This talk focuses on the material composition of terror environments as they have emerged during the Russian war in Ukraine. It traces their temporal formation, looking back to historical legacies and forward to anticipated futures, to show how these environments proliferate and persist, continuously producing subjects of war through terror. I also explore how such subjects, what I call subjects of terror environments, are formed, I conceptualize this formation through the dialectical phrase of and against, a framework that signals internal contradiction, embedded resistance, and oppositional belonging. Frequently employed in leftist theory, it describes subjects, institutions, or practices that are at once produced by a system and fundamentally in conflict with it. Now you're looking at the image that captures the edge of the 21st century terror spectacle. It shows the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear facility in Europe, with 6 active reactors engulfed in flames. This occurred at 11:03 p.m. on March 3rd, 2022, when a column of Russian heavy military machinery entered the grounds of the plant in the city of Enerhodar. In the world we live now, this unfolding catastrophe would be watched online in real time through the live streams of various Ukrainian and international nuclear monitoring organizations. Within hours, several international nuclear safety agencies began projecting potential fallout trajectories should the explosion happen, modeling the scope and speed of potential radioactive distribution. This moment marked a stark convergence between artificial intelligence and nuclear infrastructures in the contemporary theater of war, a convergence that reveals the engagement of data, visibility, and existential risk as defining features of modern warfare. The reporter on the ground, whose updates I followed that horrible night from my home in southwestern Ukraine, was 25-year-old journalist Victoria Roshchina. Her next journalistic investigation was focused on the expanding system of over 180 secret Russian prisons, black sites, basement, and industrial buildings where civilians were tortured and coerced through false confessions. To access the occupied territories, now reachable only through Russia, she traveled a long and dangerous route, eventually settling in occupied Melitopol. Soon after, she was arrested and transferred to the Taganrog military prison, described as one of the most brutal in Russia's network of detention facilities. She was meant to be part of the September prisoner exchange in 2024, but instead, her father was informed by Russian military police that she had died on September 19. Her body was returned only 6 months later, in February this year, labeled NMSPS 757, a Russian abbreviation for unidentified man. Her already mummified body could only be identified with the help of a DNA test, while it bore clear signs of torture: cuts, bruises, a broken rib, electrocution, and the removal of the brain, the eyeballs, and the part of the trachea, presumably to conceal death by strangulation. Our civilians and soldiers, returned dead or barely alive through such exchanges, are not only witnesses of Russia's torture infrastructure, their bodies are used as media through which the message of terror is sent to those who continue resistance. In the context of warfare, the apparatuses of subjection include the military infrastructures of filtration camps, detention centers, and torture facilities, what I term terror environments. These are spaces where particular subjects of war are produced for exchange, forced displacement, labor exploitation, or elimination, where the extreme violence not only disrupts material life, but reconfigures the very coordinates of subjectivity. In their most vicious forms, torture infrastructures compel individuals to confess fabricated crimes and issue false statements, forcing them to assume the identities of war criminals in order to be integrated into Russia's prisoners exchange economy. My research focuses on the war in Ukraine, but the logistics and logics I theorize extend across other zones of war, genocide, and occupation, context in which identity and subjectivity are violently reinscribed through geopolitical aggression, media, infrastructures, and the machinery of warfare. In 2022, together with my doctoral student Daria Getmanova, a scholar of Russia's settler colonial so-called reconstruction of Mariupol, where Russian development companies, often owned by the military themselves, launder vast sums of money through hastily built housing projects, often described as Potemkin villages, and marketed to economically vulnerable Russian citizens encouraged to relocate to occupied territories, while the Ukrainian population there is systematically suppressed and dispossessed under the newly imposed military regime. So together with Daria, we investigated the infrastructure of so-called filtration camps. Established by the occupying forces, the camps functioned as entry points into Russia's broader terror infrastructure. Through them, thousands of Ukrainian civilians are deported to Russia, including at least 19,000 children who have been separated from their families and forcibly moved to Russia, subjected to forced re-education, often reported abused, illegal adoption, or conscription into militarized youth programs. By tracing such displacements and the following escape of one Ukrainian family out of Russian territory, we uncovered what can only be described as an industry, the production of transactional bodies. Filtration, we argue, is not a single checkpoint, but a sprawling, prolonged infrastructure. It involves the cross-examination of bodies and digital devices, leading to systemic categorization of people who will be deported, who will be detained, or who will be executed. These are the gray zones of Russia's so-called special operation, where international law and human rights are suspended, threshold spaces that lead into the necropolitical death worlds and their terror environments. At the level of logistics and material infrastructure, these environments are administered by individuals who do not merely kill, but appear to take pleasure in committing atrocities. In Ukraine, such acts are sometimes framed through Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil, especially when Russian perpetrators are often quickly identified through their social media accounts, where they are all look good family men posing with their wives and children. The Ukrainian documentary Intercepted, the Ukrainian title of it translates as Peaceful People from 2024, directed by Oksana Karpovich, confronts this violence head-on. Composed entirely of intercepted phone calls between Russian soldiers and their families, overlaid with images of Ukrainian cities and villages destroyed by war, the film is, in Oksana's words, made out of necessity. In their conversations, soldiers speak with chilling frankness about torture, executions, and orders to kill civilians. Here is one still from the movie, and it is always this image that we hear a conversation. We were told, soldier says, that we are entering an area with a lot of civilians, and he speaks about this to his wife. And we were ordered to kill everyone we see because they might give out our positions, he explains. Myself, I also traveled through those deoccupied territories to see what was left after the deoccupation. Here I am in the Chernobyl zone because I'm also engaged in another project, writing basically the history. It's a historical project of on Chernobyl science. So this is where I am sitting in one of the offices of the Biospheric Chernobyl Reserve. And you see behind me is a wall where Russian soldiers were literally breaking through the walls to see if they can loot something. And that's where they destroyed very important data of monitoring the Chernobyl zone for several decades. So myself, I also encountered at some point those intercepted talk that Oksana Karpovich used in her film. And I first encountered them actually right after the big scale invasion, when they were made public by Ukrainian security services. It was spring 2022. And you know, as scary as they are, I couldn't stop listening to them. I needed to understand the scale of hatred directed at us and all form of violence committed. One recording in particular shocked me so deeply that I wrote about it in my war diary, which was published weekly by Dutch media theorist Gert Lovink on his Institute of Network Cultures blog. So I want to share one of my of these clips with you. It is in Russian, so you can hear it for yourself. I hope we can do it. So I will try in the next slide to run this very short several second clip, and then I will translate it for you and comment on it.
Svitlana, it's possible that you didn't share your sound in the when you shared this your slide
Okay,
share.
correct. You did hear it well, right? Should I play it again without my sound, right?
Yeah, we did not
I
hear it. If you stop the screen share, there's a box to check for sharing sound.
I will mute myself and try again. Does it sound good?
There's when you initiate the screen share, there's a moment where it asks you to share your sound. There's a little checkbox. You try that.
Okay, got it. Yes, and I should repeat everything again, right?
Yeah, if you could just start the video again.
Great, okay. Okay. Uh, you see my screen shared, and I'm starting the video again.
If you're not hearing it here, is the volume up on the YouTube video itself?
All right, okay. So then let's disregard this moment and you will be able to see it because I will tell you what's actually happening there, and you will just need to trust me about that thing. All right. So when you hear what the sound, if you don't understand Russian, simply listening, and by the way, the pictures that you see there are those people identified by Ukrainian journalists. If you don't understand Russian, simply listening to the timbre and rhythm of this brief exchange feels comforting. You can immediately sense the mutual attraction between the young woman and man, a bond, perhaps even a spark of passion. There is an intimacy in the moment they share over the phone, as if they both been anticipating this moment. Her voice is warm, alluring, seductive even, and it lingers in your ear, especially as it blends with her laughter near the end. When the audio cuts off just 32 seconds in, you're likely to want to hear it again, so enjoyable it is. It ends too quickly, too abruptly, and it feels something unresolved. But if you know Russian and start paying attention to the words, you will hear the following. Go ahead and rape those Ukrainian women, but don't tell me. Got it? She says. I can rape them without telling you, right? He asks. Yes. So I do not know anything, she says and giggles. Can I? He asks, laughing. Yes, you are allowed, she says, flirtingly. They laugh together. Just use contraception, she asks and giggles again. Okay, he says. I knew, of course, that war entails killing and torture, but hearing these recordings spoken in the voices of ordinary people from our neighboring country revealed the extreme spectrum of violence unleashed when the laws of war are suspended under the guise of special operation. This euphemism used in the Russian Federation to mask its war of aggression is paradoxically accurate. It names the war departing from law, accountability, and limits, a descent into a pure war crime enterprise. It was through this realization that I began to think more deeply about terror and the specific environment it produces, emerging in this war through both fast and slow forms of violence, some rooted in deep historical legacies, all unfolding with a complex and proliferating temporality. War, according to one theorist, is politics by other means. As a communication scholar, I suggest that war is also communication by other means. Its means ranging from bombs to bodies. To understand how this war communicates, I visualized it as a dual vector model, two intersecting logics aimed at one target. One vector is transimperial, a mode of controlled disruption designated to recalibrating global dependencies without dismantling the inter-imperial machine. This logic, often denied by my Ukrainian colleagues, is about preserving lines of communication, even through deterrence or proxy confrontation. The second vector is colonial imperial, frequently overlooked by my leftist peers, who are often still attached to Soviet anti-imperialist mythologies, myths constructed during some of the most aggressive settler colonial expansions into Siberia and the Arctic. Here, the goal is not negotiation, but erasure, suppression, dispossession, and extermination. Communication is not just suspended, it is impossible there, and it is replaced by terror. And I think if you are following the most current events, first of all, with negotiation around rare earth agreement and now so-called end of the war, you definitely see this logic. You see where communication is possible and between whom it is not possible and not happening. Clearly, war and terror are intimately related, writes Charles Townshend. The essence of terrorism is surely the negation of combat. Its targets are attacked in the way that inhibits or better prohibits self-defense. Akil Mbembe takes it further. Terror is deployed to impose submission, to expel, or to exterminate. It functions as a political technology, a mode of governance that organizes space, time, and bodies through the perpetual threat or enactment of death. Terror creates what Mbembe calls zones of uninhabitability, the prison, the camp, the occupied territory, where sovereignty operates outside the law, and where peace becomes the facade of a permanent, unseen war, misunderstood by many and sustained within its own liminal environments of terror. This war, like all wars of the 20th and 21st centuries, is conducted environmentally by territorializing the atmosphere. 2 decades ago, German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk provocatively claimed that the discovery of the environment took place in the trenches of World War I, referring to the deployment of poison gas by France and Germany in 1914. The first large-scale use of chlorine gas occurred a year later, orchestrated by German chemist and Nobel Prize winner Fritz Haber, head of Germany's gas warfare program. Here you're looking at the aerial photograph capturing gas drifting across a battlefield, an image that reveals how environmental awareness, then still emergent, became quite instrumental in the design of gas warfare. The photograph, taken from above, evokes today drone vision and visualizes how poison gas was not simply a weapon, but a medium of volumetric war. It targets not only enemy bodies, but the fragile assemblages and bioinfrastructures that sustain life both inside and outside the organism. Although most chemical weapons in World War I were ground deployed via artillery shells and canisters, this image demonstrates how gas warfare expanded the battlefield vertically, transforming a flat, trench-bound conflict into a multi-dimensional battle space. The Canadian scholar Yuriko Furuhata notes in climatic media such technologies from aviation to gas masks mark the beginning of a territorial understanding of the atmosphere. Stuart Elden describes this shift in a transformation of war from battlefield to battle space, defined by distance, depth, and three-dimensionality, where space becomes a site of dynamic offensive and energy capture. Building on this, I turn to 2 iconic cases of terror environments from the current war in Ukraine: the Russian occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the bombing of the Mariupol drama theater. Both are not limited to the moment of their attack, but unfolding in time and becoming sites where violence is continuously reproduced. In the case of Chernobyl, I trace the violence back to its Soviet past. In the case of Mariupol theater, I follow the aftermath into the future. In both, I rely on material traces to demonstrate how terror environments operate not only in space, but across extended temporalities, shaping lives and landscapes long after or before the event itself. So we'll talk now about radiation and its transition from mass media to elemental media. On April 26, 1986, during a performance test resulting in a series of explosions as reactor unit 4, vast quantities of radiation material of about 50 million curies of radiation, the equivalent of 500 Hiroshima bombs, were released into the atmosphere to become the largest uncontrolled radioactive release ever recorded for any civilian operation. This information about the explosions could have remained hidden, as it usually happened in the Soviet world, but this time radiation traveled far west to reveal itself. when at 7 a.m. on April 26, 1,257 kilometers away from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Swedish chemist Cliff Robinson, working at the Forsmark nuclear power plant near Uppsala, was passing through a radiation detector. On his return from to the workplace after breakfast, a signal went on and the world became aware of the Chernobyl accident. That's how radiation became a mass medium, and they say it made the world global before the internet. French philosopher Paul Virilio models his theory of modern technological accident on the Chernobyl disaster, the original accident of modernity, which, I can add, reveals the dual purpose of modern technology, blurring the lines between peace and war. Virilio insists that without accidents, one remains unaware of how technology functions. Technology must break to be fully realized. Without a shipwreck, he argues, the invention of the ship is incomplete. The shipwreck is consequently the futurist invention of the ship, just as the Chernobyl meltdown is the invention of the nuclear power station. End quote. The invention of the nuclear power station, thus, is finalized in 1986. I'm bringing Virilio's work here not because it is always tempting to speculate with him about the logic of technological accidents, but because now I must disagree on one point with this philosopher. I propose that the full realization of the nuclear power station, a representative technology of modernity, did not occur in 1986, but in 2022. A full realization of the Chernobyl nuclear power station as a key technology of modernity was not in the accidental meltdown, but in the non-accidental act of nuclear terrorism. To see that the non-accidental act of nuclear terrorism, to see that the non-accidental act of nuclear terrorism has an imperial genealogy, we need to treat radiation not only as a mass medium, but also as an elemental medium. Here I'm learning from American environmental media scholar Melody Yu. The empire always leaves a permanent trace and can be localized elementally by attending, as she suggests, to the material, relational, and cultural specificity of a particular environment and the kinds of relations and knowledges that particular environment affords. To read this trace, a milieu-specific analysis of the Chernobyl zone considers its elemental composition, spatial distribution of radioactive elements, and the radioactive potency of the deposit that determines the temporal characteristics of such imperial trace. An elemental medium is a milieu that determines the physical and social conditions and events that provide the environment in which someone acts or lives, or broader, a medium of biological life. It shows that there is nothing accidental about the territory of the Chernobyl zone of exclusion, nor was this territory created in 1986. The Chernobyl zone is a modern nuclear wasteland, and just as other nuclear wastelands, it reveals imperial and colonial legacies embedded in the infrastructures by which they survive and practices they support. These practices, as American historian of colonialism and environment Tracy Bryn Boyles argues, are not isolated but systemic. Colonization always transforms its subject territories. She terms these processes wastelanding, understood as rendering an environment pollutable in ways that are both ideational and material. Wastelanding, if you wish, is the manifestation of a primary process of exclusion from protection and care, the term that unsurprisingly becomes an official name of the non-accidental territory, the Chernobyl zone of exclusion. Pollution, as Canadian scholar Max Liberian argues, is best understood as the violence of colonial land relations rather than environmental damage. In the Soviet rule in Polisia, where the Chernobyl zone is located, the features of garrison colony are very apparent. As dictionary tells us, a garrison colony is a place in which troops are quartered for defensive or of other military purposes in a particular location, originally to guard it. The city of Chernobyl, with the securitized and militarized territory around it, including the city of Pripyat, founded on February 4th, 1970, to serve the future nuclear power plant that was producing military-grade plutonium, was a garrison colony of the Soviet Cold War military-industrial complex territory on the territory of Ukraine. And here you see these two Cold War objects set without literally agreement of the population. So the radioactive fallout, therefore, was only one part of the Soviet West landing machine. An elemental medium today, it exposes the polluted territory, and this territory coincides with the territory of securitization and military control that was installed there after the construction of the Soviet Cold War infrastructure, the ballistic rocket detection radar, Duga-1, and the nuclear power plant. A garrison settlement was constructed near Duga-1, where the military and their families lived until the Chernobyl catastrophe, which devastated and then literally erased the traditional ways of living on its territories, customs, agricultural techniques, unique languages, and unique dialects spoken in the Ukrainian Polisia. And that's why I feel like it's very important to remember this legacy when we speak about Chernobyl catastrophe, because indeed it's one of the ending stages of this construction of terror environments, which began way before with the Soviet colonization and installing this colonial military infrastructure. This is one case by which I'm trying to think through how the terror environments proliferates and what legacies they are built on. And now I will take you to a very different case, which has its own legacies, but I will begin in the midst of this current war, and that is I will speak about environing technologies of terror in Mariupol. So one of the largest civilian shelters in Mariupol was the Donetsk Academic Regional Drama Theater. And it was destroyed by the Russian forces by hitting it with allegedly 2 bombs on the morning of March 16, 2022. At this point, Mariupol was already heavily bombed, and people gathered in the basement of the theater, taking it as their shelter. They created a particular way of living, organized kitchen, organized the way how they share and collect information about like military threats, and they lived there for more than a week. So the bombing is an ultimate act of terror, but terror proliferated beyond this act by opening for possibilities for the occupational forces to continue with violence and suppression. And now I will explain how. Terror, I say, is ecological. It penetrates life-sustaining systems, turning the body's embeddedness in the environment against itself. It sabotages human cybernetics, making bodies sweat when their warmth must be preserved, freeze when speed is vital, inhale poisoned air when stillness is safest. Terror hijacks the body's limited self-preservation mechanisms and turns survival into a tactical uncertainty. In 2023, I joined the project by the Center for Spatial Technologies, who interviewed survivors of the Mariupol theater bombing. Together, we framed the attack not just as a single wartime atrocity, but as a production of a terror environment extended in time. And this image is created by the team of Center for Spatial Technologies. So we thought of a space where violence continues to unfold long after the explosion itself. Terror environments are materialized through solids, liquids, gases, sounds, and signals. Debris, dust, heat waves, wailing sirens, shock waves, information blackouts. They destabilize subjects not only through direct violence, but by compromising air, sound, space, and time. As again, Furuhata notes, the technologies of war, gas, drones, and others have fostered a territorial understanding of the atmosphere. And again, I remind you that Eldon very helpfully defines it as a battle space, not battlefields, defining by death, volume, and dynamic violence. So on March 16th, literally quite before, moments before the bombing, the residents of this shelter wrote the word "дети," which is children in Russian, in a massive letters on the square outside, precisely scaled for aerial visibility. And this act of environmental awareness, and I guess it always really surprises me, right? So with the precision, like this very clear understanding how big the letters should be so the pilot would read them, right? So it means what, like the subject of war, a very awareness of how they are inscribed in this environment. And again, the stop point of visibility actually kind of, also coincides with, one of these outlines of this environment, we could say. So it demonstrates that those inside were not merely victims, they were indeed subjects of war, aware of such visibility and potential targeting. It situates both aggressor and a target in a deadly relation where they operate as parts of a single assemblage. The aggressor aiming at suppressing by terror or eliminating the target entirely, and the target fighting for surveillance by any means available. And here I must say that the group of Center of Spatial Technologies based their research, their investigation of the case in many immersive interviews with the survivors who were willing to even reveal their names and be visible participants of these projects. You can see all those interviews in there on the website dedicated to this project. And also in these interviews, you can learn that there was a huge discussion in terms of, and there was no agreement in terms of whether they should or shouldn't put this word out, because they didn't know whether that would entice the strike or actually secure them. And that also, for me, indicates with this particular subjective split, right? So when survival is a kind of in between, like operates as a strategy in between these uncertainties. Terrorism, and here you see the theater itself, the site of how it looks soon after. Terrorism in war targets the most defenseless, the absence of a NATO-enforced no-fly zone over Ukraine, despite urgent appeals from Ukrainian officials since the first day of the full-scale invasion, granted Russia the freedom to continue bombing civilian areas. Similarly, Western agreements that restricted, until very recently, Ukraine from using long-range weapons like ATACMS and HIMARS in Russian territory is political and not legal. In fact, specialists in the international law were saying that the fact that Ukraine was prohibited to respond and to shoot on Russian territory is against the international laws of war. It's a quite unprecedented case in the whole war history where the country was not allowed to respond. And it wasn't allowed to respond because European countries, and not only European countries, really needed Russian gas to continue going. So that's why Ukraine wasn't allowed to respond to Russian strikes and could only respond militarily to Russia on our own territory, basically continue to polluting it with military munitions, weapons, and chemicals, and so on. So now I would like to take you into this environment and to this square near the bombed theater to show how this space was used by the occupational powers after the bombing. So here you see people who are lined around several trucks, and trucks contain food. People were, since the food supply was interrupted for quite some time, so this particular image taken from a video from the Telegram channel of all these processes, and people were invited to come to the square with the remainders of one theater and full of all possible strange smell coming from there to receive food and water. They were asked to bring their passports, which became the beginning of the process of passportization of the population by Russian forces. And so in the same, so all this kind of, you see layered practices where food distribution is layered with surveillance, is layered with the beginning of occupational passportization. And also on these tracks, you see these big screens where Russian propaganda is running. If you listen to the videos, you would hear how at this moment someone says, one Russian propaganda anchor is saying that Ukraine is now at this moment is fully occupied by Poland. So they were kind of running the narrative that Western forces are now occupied Ukraine, and those people who are now under Russian control are basically saved from this Western occupation. So that was happening during several months after the invasion, or after the bombing. After this, you can also see how the building of the theater was covered and used literally as a platform for further propaganda, where Russian and Ukrainian writers were all kind of placed on the same screen, like implying again what it was implying in Soviet time, like friendship and etc. So layering this message of friendship over the destroyed theater with buried many hundreds of bodies was also, I would say, an act of terror. And then later in September, another event happened. So the same kind of destroyed theater, the ruin, was used as a stage for a concert. And that happened on September 10, 2022. This was a commemoration of the city's World War II liberation from Nazi forces, making this kind of allusion to most recent quote unquote liberation from Ukrainian Nazi forces as it was presented to the public. So the orchestra was a Kremlin orchestra that came to Mariupol to perform Tchaikovsky military kind of symphonies. So, and also with this concert, there were three representatives. The man who speaks now, he is a representative of Pushilin, who is in charge of Donetsk, so-called Donetsk People's Republic. Then behind him is man who is was current mayor of Mariupol, and the woman is a representative of Kremlin government. So all together, they delivered message to the audience, congratulating them with liberation. And so it was interesting. I mean, the video itself was quite telling. And again, it was shown on the occupied territories and on Russian media, state media, television. But then there were other videos circulating on the web, and this is one of them that was reconstructed as a photograph, but it's from the video footage, so the space was reconstructed. Maxim Rachmaninoff, the director of Center for Spatial Technologies, did it for me. And this video and this picture is spectacular in terms of how much it reveals in terms of space control and with the orchestration of certain ideologies and propaganda. So here you see that the audience that was placed just near the destroyed theater to watch, to hear, to listen to the music, was actually the center of this whole scene. And the object was not the concert, but specifically with this audience. This audience was a central, like, let's say, a production of this whole thing. Then we see that behind the audience, we have a line of security, military men. Then we have like this huge space surrounding the audience. And then we see the fence. You can see the fence and people standing behind the fence, and there is another line of military security control. So that's where it really kind of like, almost Foucauldian sort of staging, right? So how we can see how like the subjects of war, basically with this audience who would be turned into a content for media, right? So propaganda media were kind of produced during that scene. And at the same time, they of course receive of this sort of message of terror. I would wonder, as even everyone forgets the real meaning of this bombing, right? So, but they are forced to behave as even they do not know what happened there. This was the moment on which, and that's, you can see people in the video, but the team of Center for Spatial Technologies decided to stop their investigation there. It's incredibly kind of painful for us to actually think of people who are cut off any communication and are under this regime of suppression. This is a new iron wall, really, that was happening now, and the communications with even relatives. Many of us have relatives there, and this communication is incredibly complicated now with or without VPN. Without VPN, it's actually not even possible. But when I think about this event, I also see a kind of certain movement, temporal movement, where I could speak about proliferation, right? So how the site of bombing is incorporated in as a site of terror, as a site of surveillance, as a site of new control and regime, and the site of propaganda. So it's interesting to ask in all these cases, Mariupol or Chernobyl occupation or Zaporizhia, so where is the catastrophe? And whose is the catastrophe, or for whom is a certain catastrophe. So the image of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station in flames is more than just a visual record of an attack. It is an emblem of this war-defining logic. The weaponization of shared infrastructures, environments, and planetary thresholds. Like the bombing of the Mariupol drama theater, the occupation of nuclear sites such as Chernobyl or Zaporizhzhia marks the war's shift from territorial conquest to environmental terror. These are not isolated events. They are parts of a sprawling architecture of destruction that targets not only the body, but the conditions of life itself: air, energy, time, communication, perception. The terror environments of this war operate through material traces and spectral afterlives. They burn, echo, and linger. In the smoke over Zaporizhzhia, we see the convergence of warfare, energy, colonialism, and mediated spectacle, an unfolding catastrophe visible in real time, yet continuously misrecognized or ignored. It is here, at the site where nuclear energy meets planetary insecurity, that we are forced to reckon with war as the most expansive and enduring act of environmental violence in our time. We, the subjects of terror, of and against this war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Svitlana. We will have a small Q&A. Does anybody have a question?
If anyone in the audience has a question, feel free to raise your hand. And anyone online, if you're just new to joining, you can ask questions as well. So please type those in the chat. Any questions from the audience? I see one right here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very moving. I think a lot of us in the audience would agree. Can you speak a bit to the gender dimensions of the development of a terror environment? You spoke already a lot about CRSV incidences during the Ukraine-Russian war, but I'm also just interested in knowing kind of how gender is weaponized in the creation of a terror environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Gender is weaponized, and specifically in using rape as a weapon of war. So that is a particular extremely present dimension. All women who were released from the detention occupation on the territories, like whether they are military or civilian, nearly everyone was raped. But men are also being raped. And in this case, of course, it's similar in different type of violence, but this is a constant threat. So at first, people are threatened by being raped, for example, and if they don't comply, if they don't collaborate, so the rapes are happening, and the scale of it is absolutely like everyone who returns, men or women, as they report rape. So that one thing, but of course, there are many others. Ukrainian women who are in the army, and there are many Ukrainian women who volunteer to the army. So, of course, you know that women are not mobilized, but a huge amount of women volunteered to the army to be there in different capacities, from doing medical work to being drone operators, snipers, and so on. So, and they are also the subjects of extreme violence if they are captured in the war. Within Ukrainian army itself, it's also very problematic dynamics because obviously Ukraine was still had to do a lot of work in terms of recognition of rights, women rights, and so on. And lots of things were in progress, but everything basically, we could say, kind of exploded and interrupted with the war. So as a lot of things, a lot of understandings were still in progress, and suddenly women are also facing having hard time even within in the context of Ukrainian army too. So that most kind of that's has nothing to do with terror, obviously, but it has to do with certain again pressure, suppression, violence, I would say sometimes, if even verbal. But terror, the terror dimension is really unfolding in the zones of occupation and imprisonment.
I see another question here.
Thank you so much, Svitlana, for this really moving, moving talk. I wanted to maybe make a connection to the first talk that Shumrit gave at the beginning of the day, where she was talking about the commercial war image and technologies that use drones, target particular zones, create kill boxes, or kind of create a kind of precision. And we were talking together after her talk about the strategies of control, hold, and build, and how the processes of building have been in some ways renounced. So there's no longer even an effort or a rhetoric of actually building. And I was really struck, I was thinking about that insight in relationship to this, because there's such a recursivity of control, hold, control, hold, control, hold, that like is being repeated in the way in which the audience then has another gate behind it, then has another gate behind it. And that affects the temporality of a kind of terror environment that you're proposing here. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as a kind of military technological process that seems to be at play here.
Yeah, here I would say like a couple of things. One is that in what you're asking, I sense a kind of a problem that with my co-author Nick Dyer-Westward we addressed in the book Cyberwar and Revolution. What we started looking at wars and protests and any kind of mobilization and how technology is used during those events. And we were struck to see how everything invented, right? So new ways of using technology for tactical reasons by protesters, for spreading the cause, for mobilizing again, to raising against something and something. So how all these inventions were eventually basically hijacked by power and used against the protesters. This was probably kind of a number of cases in different countries where we observed similar but different cases, and that's where it became absolutely clear of this appropriation and reappropriation of certain tactical uses of technology and certain strategies. So nothing remains safe. Technology goes, or certain processes or technological assemblages go from hands to hands. And obviously, even technologies that we use for mobilizing, for surviving, for protecting, and etc., have all those legacies of which we are aware. But then that's all we have, certain technology. And it strikes me how, of course, in the context of the war, right? So we ask even less of these questions in terms of, the histories and legacies and corporate politics that is associated with this technology. But that's what I also connect to this very heavy, difficult notion of subject of war. It's not that we are not entirely unaware of the risks and legacies and what is in those technologies, but then there is no choice. And that's what this off and against means for me too. So just recently, I also gave a talk in which I explored the presence of Palantir and Starlink and other technologies in the war of Ukraine, the data supplied by Palantir, and how deeply integrated it is in the Ukrainian battle space and battlefield, right? So, and how, in fact, it needs Ukraine, how it needs also this war to go on. It's quite scary. And actually, what I also discovered, interestingly, it's not necessarily on your question, but I just want to mention this, that how Palantir uses Ukrainian battlefield for advertisement of its technology, and it is Palantir that promotes Ukraine as next Israel. So with this particular identification, and I know that Ukrainian society at first uh, many groups were kind of seeing itself or aligning with Israel. Situation is very different now, in fact. And there are many groups in Ukraine supporting Palestine, and this awareness is growing. But it was interesting for me to discover this very powerful channel that, in fact, promotes this idea as the Ukraine's new Israel is Palantir. And if you look at volunteer research channels, that's where it comes from. And that's where kind of like the insistence on that. So all this strange and scary assemblages and arrangements, this was also subject of war kind of implies, right? So now the technology is used for defense, but it's incredibly scary to think of what they can actually learn on our battlefield and how this technology would be used and abused in all other fields outside war zones.
Do we have any other questions from the audience, either here in person or online? Oh, I have one here.
Thank you for the very interesting and moving talk. If you could come back a bit on the two vectors in the middle of your speech in which you compared the trans-imperial violence in which there's like deterrence and communication, and the imperial colonial violence in which there's terror and like suppressing or silencing. So if I understand well, you're speaking here in the trans-imperial vector of like the violence between rivaling colonial imperial forces for like seizing territory, and then they come to some agreement through the practice of like war as a pursuing of communication, whether on the other hand, with the imperial colonial vector, you impose an atmosphere of terror in which life becomes unbearable and unlivable, a bit like necropolitics from Achille Mbembe. Can you expand a bit on that, please? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Exactly. So this is where I'm engaging with all very diverse explanations of how this war begins and what is at stake and etc. So, and mostly in Ukraine, the dominating kind of explanation is that it's all between Ukraine and Russia, right? So that's like this all ongoing Russian attempt to colonize, to have Ukraine under its control, and etc. So in Ukraine, no other reason is really considered as valuable. And while everywhere else, when I hear in the North America the readings of this war, they never consider Ukrainian agency or presence as anything but the proxy field, and that is a kind of very desubjectivizing, strange understanding, right? So that's where the theory about competing powers and reconfiguration of the world order is the major explanation. So in my view, I actually think those two, and maybe there are even more vectors that causing and has caused all this tension, conflict, war, very much present, unfolding, and following their own reasons, right? So Ukraine, it just suffers immensely in both ways, because I believe that this trans-imperial relation is, again, as I mentioned, this is literally a conversation and negotiation that is real. And even though now we see sanctions applied and other tensions and etc., but powers tend to communicate, and even in the times of the Cold War, right? So there was always with that a red line, set between the two powers, right? So this is a kind of rivalry that presumes communication, does not exclude it. And sometimes when I was thinking about this complexity of trans-imperial relation, right? So how Russia never was considered as an imperial agency, even though there's immense research by Russian scholars, for example, right? So for decades about all the settler colonialism going towards Northern Asia and the Arctic, right? So it was for one of the largest colonized territories, over 100 of indigenous and unrecognized communities that are there, and nobody speaks about them, right? So nobody, Canada is one of those places where I encountered the major awareness, and of course still very problematic and etc., right? So but awareness and the willingness to speak about ceded or unceded territories, etc., and nobody still heard of Russian imperial violence and settler colonialism. Instead, there was very much uh, fascination by all sort of Soviet mythology that is taken quite literally, and that really worked. So, and in this sense, sometimes I feel like it was almost beneficial for not necessarily Canada, but I see what European countries who were really benefiting from Russian occupational policies, because the extraction of gas and oil from the indigenous land or coal, right? So which is a terrible environmental events. It's done under conditions of the 19th century, really, right? So with that sort of pollution, with that sort of unfairness, people are dying there even today on those sites, and yet nobody cared buying Russian gas or Russian oil, or so-called Russian gas and oil, which is not Russian, but again from Yamal or Altai and stuff like that. So in a sense, everyone was willing to close eyes to those arrangements and halve the trade with Russia, right? So that's what the essence of trans-imperial continuous machinery, capitalist machinery is for me, right? So this system doesn't need to break. It's just a kind of certain little tension has to be created there, and then it has to be back working, right? So, and when I again follow these negotiations now, I think a lot of the real things come up through the mouth of Trump, for example, or his team, right? So that's where the real Lacanian real almost communicates itself about what the essence of trans-imperial arrangements. And then, of course, colonial imperial is quite different, right? So nobody communicates with Ukraine. It doesn't exist, right? So Russian president says this, American president repeats it. And that is literally the strive for Ukrainian resources, land, and people, because Russia now also needs people. And that's why all the detention infrastructure is very important, because they keep stealing Ukrainian people for a variety of purposes. So, and that's where, again, that's mostly the policies of terror. It's produced through terror, and it's expected the Ukraine is gonna give up being not able to deal with this terror politics.
Thank you. I think that might be all of the questions from those of us here gathered today. So I, along with everyone here, just want to thank you again so much. This was a wonderful presentation. A round of applause, everyone. Thank you. We'll
Thank
say
you
goodbye
very much.
Svitlana, I know it's very late where you are, so thank you again. Have a lovely evening. For all of you, thank you for coming into Fourth Space today and for activating these amazing conversations. For those of you online and everyone here in the space, thank you for your questions, your contributions. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream elements now, but just a quick reminder that these conversations that you've had today are already available on our YouTube channel, and if you'd like to revisit or share them. So please join us. The exhibit will be open until 6 o'clock, and then again tomorrow, you are welcome to come and peruse and have an open visit. Both the artist Alexandra and the curator Gabrielle will be here to answer any questions that you might have in a more casual setting tomorrow. So join us. It'll be a little different vibe. You'll be able to get a little bit closer with the works and have a more one-on-one conversation with them. Thank you so much, everyone, and have